Section 8 of Men of the Deep Waters by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Captain of the Onion Boat. Big John Carlos, captain of the Santa, stood looking up at the long tapered window in the otherwise great gray blank of the convent wall a dozen yards away. The wall formed the background of the quay, and between it and the side of the vessel was a litter of unloaded gear and cargo. The captain's face, as he stared upward at that one lonesome window, had an extraordinarily set expression, and his mate, a little lop-shouldered man, very brown and lean, watched him over the combing of the main hatchway with a curious grimace of half sympathy and half curiosity.
"Old man's got it bad as ever,"
he muttered in an accent and language that spoke of the larger English. He transferred his gaze from the silent form of the skipper, standing in the stern, to the long taper of the one window that broke the towering side of the convent. Presently the thing for which the two men watched came into view, as it did twice daily at morning and evening, a long line of half-veiled nuns who were obviously ascending some stairway within the convent, onto which this solitary window threw light. Most of the women went by the window quietly, with faces composed, and looking before them. But here and there a young nun would take this opportunity to glance out into the carnal world which they had renounced forever. Young beautiful faces they were. They looked out momentarily, showing doubly human, because of the cold ascetic garb of the renunciation which framed them, then were gone on from sight in the long steadily moving procession of silent figures. It was about the middle of the procession, after a weary line of seeming mutes had gone past, that the mate saw that for which he waited, for suddenly the great body of the captain stiffened and became rigid as the head of one of the moving figures turned and stared out onto the quay. The mate saw her face clearly. It was still young and lovely, but seemed very white and hopeless. He noted the eager, hungry look in the eyes, and then the wonderful way in which they lit up as with a strange inward fire at the sight of the big man standing there, and the whole face seemed to quiver into living emotion. Immediately afterwards, she was gone past, and more mutes were making the gray ascending line.
"Gord, that's her,"
said the mate, and glanced towards his master. The face of the big skipper was still upturned, and set with a fixed, intense stare, as though even now he saw her face at the long window. His body was yet rigid with intensity, and his great hands gripped tightly the front of his slack jumper, straining it unconsciously down upon his hips. For some moments longer he stood like this, lost to all knowledge except the tellings of his memory, and stunned with his emotions. Then he relaxed abruptly, as if some string within him had been loosed, and turned towards the open hatchway, where the mate bent once more to his work.
"Why don't you get her out?"
the mate remarked to himself.
"They've been doing that years and years, from what I can see and hear and breaking their blessed hearts. Why the hell don't he get her out? It's easy to see she's a woman, a sight more than a bloomin' nun."
In all of which the little crooked-shouldered mate showed a fund of common sense, but likewise an insufficient ability to realize how thoroughly a religious belief may sometimes prove a stumbling block in the pathway to mere human happiness. How a man of the stamp of Big John Carlos came to be running an onion boat must be conjectured. His name is explained by his father having been a Spaniard and his mother an Englishwoman. Originally, Big John had been a merchant of a kind, going to sea in his own ship and trading abroad. As a youth he had become engaged to Marvana Della, whose father had owned much property farther up the coast. Her father had died, and she had been an heiress, sought by all the youths about, but he, Big John Carlos, had won her. They were to have been married on his return from his next trading voyage, but the report went home to his sweetheart that he had been drowned at sea, and indeed he had truly fallen overboard, but had been picked up by a China-bound sailing ship, and had been a little over a year lost to his friends before he had managed to reach home, to carry the news that he still lived. For this was before the days of the telegraph, and his one letter had gone astray. When at last he reached home, it was to find sad changes. His sweetheart, broken-hearted, had become a nun at the great convent of St. Sebastian's, and had endowed it with all her wealth and lands. What attempts he had made to have speech with her I do not know, but if his religious scruples had allowed her to beg her to renounce her vows and retirement, and return to the world to be his wife, they had certainly been unsuccessful, though it is quite conceivable that no word had ever passed between them, since she had put the world behind her. From then onward through 9 long years, Big John Carlos had traded along the coast. His former business he had dropped, and now he wandered from port to port in his small craft. And twice in every year he would come alongside of the little wharf opposite to the great gray wall of the convent, and there lie for a week, watching year by year that long narrow window for the 2 brief glimpses daily of his lost sweetheart. After a week he would go. It was always a week that he stayed there by the old wharf. Then, as if that had exhausted his strength, as if the pain of the thing had grown in that time to be too dreadful to continue, he would haul out and away whatever the weather or state of trade. All of this the little twisted mate knew, more or less clearly in detail, having learned it in the previous visits which he had made with Big John Carlos to the insignificant port where the convent stood. And she, what can the young nun have thought and felt? How she must have fought to endure the gray, weary months between the far-apart visits, and day by day glanced out of the tall stair window as she passed in the long mute procession for a sight of the little onion boat and the big man standing in the stern watching, tense and silent, for that one brief glimpse of her as she passed in the remorseless line of figures. And something of this also the little crooked-shouldered mate had realized vaguely and had achieved an instant, though angry sympathy. But his point of view was limited and definite. "Why the hell don't he get her out?" was his brief formula, and that marked the limit of his imagination, and therefore of his understanding. His own religious beliefs were of the kind that are bred in the docks, London docks in his case, and fostered in dirty forecastles, and now he was "come down to this onion shunting," as he would have worded it. Yet whatever his religious lack, or even his carelessness on a point of ethics, he was thoroughly and masculinely human.
"Why the hell,"
he began again in his continual grumble to himself, and had no power to conceive that the woman, having taken a certain step, might believe that step to be unretraceable, that usage, belief, and finally, bred of these two, conscience might forbid even the thought, stamping it as a crime that would shut her out from the joy of the everlasting. The joy of the everlasting. The little twisted man would have grinned at you had you mentioned it.
"Why the hell don't he get her out?"
would have been his reply, accompanied by a profuseness of tobacco juice. And yet it is conceivable that the heart of the woman was, even this long while, grown strong to do battle for dear happiness, her heart that had known silently and secretly and dumbly all along the unnatural wickedness of her outrage of her womanhood. Visit by visit through the long years, her heart must have grown fiercely strong to end this torture which her brain, darkened with the clouds of belief, had put upon her to endure through all her life. And so, all unknowingly, because of the loyal brain that would not be aware of the growing victory of her heart, she was come to a condition in which her beliefs held her no more than if they had been cords that had rotted upon her, as indeed they might be said to have done. That she was free to come, the little mate had seen using his eyes and his heart and his wit. To him it was merely a matter of ways and means, physical. Why the hell? That was his puzzle. Why? With an angry impatience that came near to verging upon the borderland of scorn, the little mate would question inwardly. Was Big John Carlos bit with them religious notions, same as the other Dagos? He did not understand the complaint or how it was achieved, but he knew as an outside fact that there was something of that kind which infected the peoples along the coasts he traveled. If Big John were not troubled this way, why the hell? And so he would return to his accustomed formula, working furiously in sheer irritation of mind.
"If he ain't religious, what is it? Can't he see the way her eyes, blessed well, looks at him? Can't he see she's mad and double mad to be out with him?" Why did not John Carlos attempt to win back for himself the one thing that he desired in all the world? Maybe, and I think that it is very possible, in the early years of his return, he had so striven. But the young nun, shaken with the enormousness of the thought, hopelessly weighted with her vows, had not dared to think upon it, had retreated with horror from the suggestion, had turned with an intention of double ardor to seek in her religious duties the calm and sweetness, the peace and joy, which she felt to be lost to her forever in any more earthly way. And then had followed the long years, with her heart fighting silently and secretly almost from herself, unto victory. And the man, having lost the force of that first fierce unpenting of his intention to win her,
and mayhap having been repulsed, as it would seem to be his masculine mind, hopelessly, had fallen back under the sway of the religious beliefs which ruled him in his more normal hours, and so year by year had withheld from any further attempt to win her, striving to content his soul with those 2 brief visits each year to the old wharf, each time to endure a mad week of those futile watchings for his beloved. Yet, in him, as in the woman, there had been going forward, without his knowledge, that steady disruption of religious belief, the rotting and decaying of all arbitrary things before the primal need of the human heart, so that the olden barriers of impossibility were now but as shadows that would be gone in a moment when next the force of his need should urge him to take his heart's desire. His first attempt, if there had ever been such, had been the outcome of his natural want, his love, but lacking the foundations of sureness of himself and of his power to withstand the future. Indeed, it is conceivable that he had succeeded at the first, and gained his desire. The 2 of them would have wilted in the afterblast of thought and fear of the hereafter, and in the fires of scruples which would have burned in their path through all the years. But now, whatever they might do, they would do, if it ever came to pass, with a calm and determined intention, having done their thinking first, and weighed all known costs, and proved their strength, and learned the utterness of their need to be truly greater than all else that might be set as balance against it. And because of this they were ripe, wanting only the final stimulus to set into action the ready force that had concentrated through the years. Yet, strangely, neither the man nor the woman knew, as I have known, that they had developed to this. Their brains refused to know. Their consciences looked, each with its blind eye, at their hearts, and saw nothing to give cause of offense to the ethical in them. Or did conscience catch an odd glimpse with its seeing eye of impossible wickedness, there followed hours of imagined repentance, deep and painful, resulting in a double assuredness within the brain, and manufactured parts of a conquered and chastened heart, and of fiercer resolutions for the future torture of salvation. But always deep within, the unconquerable heart fought for victory that was each year more assured. And so, as you have already seen, these 2, the man and the woman, were but waiting. The man for some outward stimulus to put into action all the long-pent force in him, revealing to him his actual nature, developed and changed in the course of the long years of pain, until he should be scarcely likely to recognize himself in the first moments of his awakening to this reality. And the woman waiting subconsciously for the action of the man to bring her to knowledge of the realities, to an awareness of the woman she had become, of the woman into which she had developed, unable any more to endure the bondage of aught save her heart, that leaped to the ordering of Mother Nature. Nay, more fiercely and steadfastly eager to take with both hands the forbidden joy of her natural birthright, and calm and resolute and unblinking to face the future, which its unsolvable problem of the joy of the everlasting. And thus were these 2 standing, as it might be said, on the brink of their destinies, waiting with blinded eyes, and as that they listened unknowingly for the coming of the unknown one who should give the little push forward, and so cause them to step over the borderland into all natural and long-craved for happiness. Who would be that one?
"Why the 'ell don't we get her out?"
the mate had asked the first hand, who knew all the story, having sailed years with big John Carlos. But the first hand had raised his arms in horror, and made plain in broken English his opinion of the sacrilege, though that was not how he pronounced it.
"Sacrilege be jiggered,"
the mate had replied, humping his twisted shoulders.
"I suppose, though, there be a holy rumpus, eh?"
The first hand had imitated very definitely that there would be a rumpus, which the mate ferreted out, might involve some very unpleasant issues, both for the man and the woman guilty of such a thing. The first hand spoke, in broken English, as if he were the religious conscience of his nation. Such things could not be tolerated. His phraseology did not include such words, but he was sufficiently definite.
"Nice healthy lot of savages, you,"
the mate had explained after listening to much intolerant jabbering.
"Strike me if you ain't cannibals."
And straightway saddled on to the unfortunate Catholic faith, the sinners peculiar to a hot-blooded and emotional people, whose enthusiasms and prejudices would have been just as apparent had they been called forth by some other force than their faith, or by a faith differently shaped and denominated. It was the little crooked mate who was speaking to Big John Carlos in the evening of the 6th day of their stay beside the old wharf, and the big man was listening in a stunned kind of silence. Through those 6 days the little man had watched the morning and evening tragedy, and the sanity of his free thoughts had been as yeast in him. Now he was speaking, unlading all the things that he had to say.
"Why the hell don't you take her out?"
he had asked in so many words, and to him it had seemed that very evening that the woman's eyes had been saying the same thing to the captain, as she looked her brief, dumb agony of longing across the little space that had lain between, yet which, as it were, was in verity the whole width of eternity. And now the little mate was putting it all into definite words, standing there, an implement of fate or providence or the devil, according to the way that you may look at it, his twisted shoulder heaving with the vehemence of his speech.
"You didn't orter do it, Captain," he said. "You're breaking her up, and you're breaking you up, and no good to it. Why the hell don't you do something? Rescue her or keep away. If it's hell for you, it's just as much hell for her. She'll come in like a little bloomin' bird. See how she looks at you. She's fair asking you to come and take her out of it all, and you're just standing there. My Gord!"
"What can I do?" said the captain hoarsely, and put his hands suddenly to his head. He did not ask a question or voice any hopelessness, but just gave out the words as so many sounds mechanically. For he was choked, suffocating during those first few moments, with the vast surge of hope that rose and beat upward in him, as the little twisted mate's words crashed ruthlessly through the shrouding films of belief. And suddenly he knew. He knew that he could do this thing, that all scruples, all bonds of belief, of usage, of blind fears for the future, and of the hereafter, were all fallen from him, as so much futile dust. Until that moment, as I have shown to you before, he had not known that he could do it, had not known of his steady and silent development. But now, suddenly, all his soul and being lighted with hope, he looked inward and saw himself as the man he was, the man to which he had grown and come to be. He knew. He knew. Would she? Would she? The question came unconsciously from his lips, but the little twisted man took it up.
"Arsk her! Arsk her!"
he said vehemently.
"I know she'll come. I seen it in her eyes tonight when she looked out at you. She was saying as plain as you're at, 'Why the hell don't you take me out? Why the hell don't you? You arsk her, and she'll come like a bird.'"
The little mate spoke with the eagerness of conviction, and indulged in no depressing knowledge of incongruities.
"Arsk her,"
was his refrain.
"You arsk her."
"How?" said the captain, coming suddenly to realities. The little man halted and stumbled over his unreadiness. He had no plan, nothing but his feelings. He sought around in his mind and grasped at an idea.
"Writing on an hatch cover with chalk,"
he said, triumphant.
"Lean the hatch cover by you. When she comes, point to it, and she'll read it."
"Huh," said the captain in a strange voice, as if he both approved and at the same time had remembered something.
"Then she'll nod,"
continued the little man.
"No one else ever looks out of that winder, scarcely not to think to read writing anyway, and you can cover it till she's due to show. Then we'll plan how to get her out."
All that night Big John Carlos paced the deck of his little craft alone, thinking, and thrilling with great surges of hope and maddened determination. In the morning he put the plan to the test, only that he wrote the question on the hatch cover in peculiar words that he had not used all those long gray years, for he had made use of a quaint but simple transposition of letters, which had been a kind of love language between them in the olden days. This was why he had called Ha so strangely, being minded suddenly of it, and to have the sweetness of using it to that one particular purpose. Slowly the line of gray moving figures came into view descending. Big John Carlos kept the hatch cover turned to him and counted, for well he knew just when she would appear. The 109th mute would pass, and the 110th would show the face of his beloved. The order never changed through the years in that changeless world within. As the 107th figure passed the narrow window, he turned the hatch cover so that the writing was exposed, and pointed down to it so that his whole attitude should direct her glance instantly to his question, that she might have some small chance to read it in the brief moment that was hers as she went slowly past the narrow panes. The 109th figure passed down from sight, and then he was looking dumbly into her face as she moved into view, her eyes already strained to meet his. His heart was beating with a dull, sickening thudding, and there seemed to be just the faintest mists before his vision. But he knew that her glance had flown eagerly to the message, and that her white face had flashed suddenly to a greater whiteness, disturbed by the battle of scores of emotions loosed in 1 second of time. Then she was gone downward out of sight, and he let the hatch cover fall, gripping the shrouds with his left hand. The little twisted man stole up to him.
"She saw, Captain. She hadn't time to answer, not to know if she was on her head or on her heels. Look out tonight, she'll nod then."
He brought it all out in little whispered jerks, and the big man, wiping his forehead, nodded. Within the convent, a woman, outwardly a nun, was even then descending the stairs with shaking knees, and a brain that had become, in a few brief instants, a raging gulf of hope. Before she had descended 3 steps below the level of the window, even whilst her sight memory still held the message out for her brain to read and comprehend, she had realized that, spiritually, she was clothed only with the ashes of belief and fear and faith. The original garment had become charred to nothing in the fire of love and pain with which the years had enveloped her. No bond held her, no fear held her. Nothing in all the world mattered except to be his for all the rest of her life. She took and realized the change in her character in a moment of time. 8 long years had the yeast of love been working in her, which had bred the chemistry of pain. But only in that instant did she know and comprehend that she was developed so extensively as to be changed utterly from the maid of 8 years gone. Yet in the next few steps she took, she'd adopted herself to the new standpoint of her fresh knowledge of herself. She had no pause or doubt, but acknowledged with an utter startled joyfulness that she would go, that all was as nothing to her now except that she go to him. Willing, beyond all words that might express her willingness to risk, aye, even to exchange the unknown joy of the everlasting for this certain mess of pottage that was so desired of her hungry heart. And having acknowledged to herself that she was utterly willing, that she had no thought of anything but to pass on the knowledge of her altered state to the man who would be waiting there in the little onion boat at sunset. That evening, just before the dusk, Big John Carlos saw the 110th gray figure nod swiftly to him in passing, and he held tightly to the shroud until the suffocation of his emotion passed from him. After all, the rescue, if it can be named by a term so heroic, proved a ridiculously easy matter. It was the spiritual prison that had held the woman so long. The physical expression of the same was easily made to give up its occupant. In the morning, expectant, she read in her fleeting glance at the onion boat a message written on the hatch cover. She was to be at the window at midnight. That evening, as she ascended in the long gray line of mutes for the last weary time, she nodded her utter agreement and assent. After night had fallen thickly on the small deserted wharf, the little twisted mate and the captain reared a ladder against the convent side. By midnight they had cut out entirely the lead framing of all the lower part of the window. A few minutes later the woman came. The captain held out his big hands in an absolute silence and lifted the trembling figure gently down onto the ladder. He steadied her firmly, and they climbed down to the wharf and were presently aboard the vessel, with no word yet between them to break the 10 years of loneliness and silence. For it was 10 years, as you will remember, since Big John Carlos had sailed on that voyage of dismay. And now, full-grown man and woman, they stood near to each other, in a dream quietness, who had lived on 2 sides of eternity so long. And still they had no word. Youth and maiden they had parted with tears. Man and woman they met in a great silence, too grown and developed to have words over easily at such a moment of life. Yet their very quiet held a speech too full and subtle, aye, and subtle, for made words of sound. It came from them almost as if it were a soul fragrance, diffused around them, and made visible only in the quiet trembling of hands that reached unknowing unto the hands of the other. For the 2 were full grown, as I have said, and had come nigh to the complete awareness of life, and the taste of the brine of sorrow was yet in them. They had been ripened in the strange twin suns of love and pain that ripen the unseen fruit of the soul. Their hands met trembling and gripped a long, long while, till the little twisted mate came stumbling aft, uneasy to be gone. Then the big man and the fragile woman stood apart, the woman dreaming while the big man went to give the little mate a hand. Together the two men worked to get the sail upon the small vessel, and the ropes cast off. They left the first and second hands sleeping. Presently, with light airs from the land, they moved outward to the sea. There was no pursuit. All the remainder of that night the small onion boat went outward into the mystery of the dark, the big man steering and the woman close beside him, and for a long while the constant silence of communion. As I have said, there was no pursuit, and at dawn the little twisted man wondered. He searched the empty sea and found only their own shadow upon the almost calm waters. Perhaps the first hand had held a wrong impression. The peoples of the coast may have been shocked when they learned. Maybe they had never learned. Convents, like other institutions, can keep their secrets, odd whiles. Possibly this was one of those times. Perhaps they remembered with something of worldly wisdom that they held the substance, wherefore trouble overmuch concerning the shadow of a lost nun. Certainly not to the bringing of an ill name upon their long holiness. Surely Satan can be trusted, etc. We can all finish the well-hackneyed thought. Or maybe there were natural human hearts in diverse places that, knowing something of the history of this love tale, held sympathy in silence, and silence in sympathy. Is this too much to hope? That evening, the man and the woman stood in the stern looking into the wake, whilst the second hand steered. Forward in the growing dusk there was a noise of scuffling. The little humped mate was having a slight difference of opinion with the first hand, who had incautiously made use of a parallel word for sacrilege for the second time. The scuffling continued, for the little twisted man was emphatic.
"Sacrilege be jiggered! What the hell?"
The physical sounds of his opinion drowned the monotonous accompaniment of his speech. The small craft sailed on into the sunset, and the two in the stern stared blindly into distances, holding hands like two little children. End of Section 8.